Chapter 8. All the evidence they could possibly need. And we have 4 witnesses who saw you with it, Mr. Tanner was saying. My mother, on reception when you came back. Christine and Bunny Shumway both saw you carrying it with you on the way to Frank Lairtide's room, and Frank says you were still carrying it when he sent you away. 1 custard slice in an open-ended cardboard box inside a paper bag. The same custard slice that Ricky was eating when he suddenly collapsed, started screaming and died. He'd eaten about 1/3 of it. Custard slice? Paul remembered. The coffee bar, the round-headed man who told him about leaving Manitoba because of the war. He'd made Paul take on a cup of coffee and another custard slice, and Ricky had bumped into him in the corridor. I was there when it happened, Mr. Tanner went on. Me and Kaz Suslowich and Sophie Pettingell, we all saw it. He took the cake out of the bag, mentioned that he'd met you in the passage and you'd given it to him. He said how generous you were and wondered how you knew custard slices were his favourite. Then he dropped to the ground and 2 minutes later he was dead. Mr. Tanner nodded at the 4 goblins, who tightened their grip on Paul a little. Just to make sure, he went on, I had Frank Lairtide analyse it. He's a fully qualified forensic sorcerer. He says there's enough arsenic in what's left of that cake to poison a small army. Mr. Tanner folded his arms. I wonder if there's anything you'd like to say at this point? Yes, the bloody is, Paul yelped. I didn't do it. Mr. Tanner frowned. Anything apart from that, he said. The truth, for instance. Paul knew better than to struggle with 4 goblins holding on to him. It didn't happen like that. Like you just said, yes, I brought a cake back with me. Custard slice. Yes, a custard slice, in a box, in a bag, just like you said. And yes, I bumped into Ricky in the corridor. But I didn't offer him the bloody thing. He dropped these really heavy hints about how custard slice was his favourite. Oh, I see, Mr. Tanner said calmly. And then you offered it to him, and he took it. No, Paul scowled. Sorry, actually yes, but only because he made it obvious he wanted the stupid thing. What I mean is I didn't bring it back on purpose to give it to him. Mr. Tanner's lips curled in an expression that was a smile in the way a young, hungry lion is a kitten. I see, he said. You offered him the cake, he took it, but it's nothing like what I just said. All right, he went on. Tell me where you got this cake from. It was this little sandwich place, Paul said. Kind of like a poor man's Starbucks, just a few yards down the road from the Water Pebbles where I got Frank. Mr. Lairtide's book. Book. That's right. Didn't Mr. Lairtide's tell you? He sent me out to pick up a book he'd ordered in Water Pebbles. Right. Mr. Tanner's scowl deepened. You're quite sure about that? Of course. You just asked for... Mr. Lairtide's doesn't seem to remember it quite like that, Mr. Tanner said. He told me you vanished for a while, didn't say where you'd been when you got back, and you had a styrofoam cup of coffee and a cake box in a bag with yellow showing through. He didn't say anything about any book. But it's there, on his desk. It hadn't been, of course. When Mr. Tanner went to look, there was no sign of a big book full of pictures of medieval Canadian illuminated manuscripts, and when Paul told him what he'd seen in the book, Mr. Tanner just looked straight past him, as though he was pretending for Paul's own benefit that he hadn't heard it. He even sent Christine to see if she could find the sandwich bar, and needless to say, she couldn't. No trace of it to be seen, she reported back. The location Paul had described, she added, was the lingerie department of Marks and Spencer. It wasn't even a separate shop. Mr. Tanner reported her findings to Paul in the strong room, where he'd been locked in, closely watched by the 4 large goblins. They hadn't said a word while he'd been waiting for Christine to get back, but they'd stared at him a lot, and 2 of them had mimed chewing food and grinned. He didn't really want to think what they meant by that. So what are you going to do? Paul asked when Mr. Tanner had finished telling him about Christine's expedition. Are you going to call the police? Mr. Tanner almost sort of laughed. I don't think so, he said. We prefer to deal with this sort of thing ourselves. Security, you see. Besides, he went on, if we had you arrested for murder, all they'd do is lock you up in prison for the rest of your life. And what good would that do anybody? He sighed. Much better if we handle it our way, which we're fully entitled to do, of course, since we own you. That way, it's just an accountancy issue, writing off a dead loss, as it were. Paul really didn't like the sound of that. But this is stupid, he said. I didn't kill anybody, really. I went to that coffee bar place, the one that doesn't exist. Yes, but lots of things don't exist where you lot are concerned. You know that better than I do. It was probably a magic sandwich bar. Really, Mr. Tanner raised an eyebrow. If he'd been taller, faintly greenish, and had pointed ears, he'd probably have said, "Fascinating. What's the difference between a magic sandwich bar and an ordinary one?" "I went there," Paul said grimly, "and I had a coffee and a custard slice. Then, when I was about to go, the bloke said, 'Have another coffee.' On the house, and another slice of cake. I said I had to get back to the office. He said I could have them to take out. I didn't want to hurt his feelings, so I said yes." "I see. And he gave you a poisoned cake. Any idea why?" "No, of course not." "You hadn't upset him or anything?" "No, at least, I don't think so. I asked him if he had a twin brother who ran a fine art and toothbrush shop, and he said no. He came from Manitoba. He'd left there because of the war." "What war?" Paul shrugged. "The Canadian Civil War, I suppose. Only, of course—" "Ah," said Mr. Tanner, "that war. Before you follow this line any further," he went on, "maybe I ought to mention that in the sorcerer community we don't actually recognise insanity pleas as a valid defence to a murder charge. Just thought I'd tell you that before you sprain your imagination." Paul drew a deep breath because he'd need a lot of air if he was going to explain about Canada and Miss Hook and Custard, not to mention swords and mermaids and various other related issues. But as he did so, he caught sight of the look in Mr. Tanner's eye and decided it could probably wait until later, until after they'd had him ritually killed, for example. Instead, he said, "Really, I didn't do it. Why would I want to do a thing like that anyway?" Mr. Tanner shrugged. "We were hoping you'd tell us that," he said. "We did sort of wonder." "Because," Paul went on, "there's absolutely no reason why I'd want to hurt him, let alone kill him. He saved my life once. Well, Paul amended. "He sort of saved it, and he took me out to lunch on my first day here, which was really a nice gesture. All right, he did kill me that one time, but that was a total misunderstanding. He thought it was all perfectly okay, and I didn't hold a grudge or anything." Mr. Tanner frowned. "He killed you? You've got that a bit arse-about-face, surely." "No, he killed me with a crossbow." Paul stopped short because, of course, Ricky Wormtorter hadn't shot Phil Marlowe with a crossbow. He'd shot Paul Carpenter. The same penny appeared to have dropped in Mr. Tanner's mind, though it bounced off in a different direction. "A crossbow," Mr. Tanner said. "I remember the late Paul Carpenter telling some sort of cockamamie story about Wormtorter shooting him with a crossbow. Are you saying he shot you too? Because—" "Sorry," Paul said desperately. "I was mixing him up with someone else I once knew, so please forget I said that. Red herring. The fact is," he went on, "I only actually met him for the very first time today, when he asked me for that bloody cake. Why do I want to kill someone I've never even met before?" Mr. Tanner shook his head. "Lots of people do that," he said. "Soldiers, for instance. Also, more to the point, assassins and hired killers. Would that happen to be a sideline of yours by any chance?" That notion was so absurd that Paul started to laugh, but he didn't get very far. There was a look in Mr. Tanner's eyes that soaked up laughter like blotting paper. No, Paul said. "No, it isn't. I never killed anybody in my life." "Until today." "Not even today," Paul said. And as he spoke, he recalled the graceful arc the TV anchorman's head had described as it sailed through the air. "I gave him a cake. That's different. Obviously somebody wanted to kill me and—" "Right. Why would he want to do that?" Paul shrugged. "I already told you. I haven't got a clue. Maybe he didn't know the stupid thing was poisoned. Maybe it was all an accident or something. I don't know. Look, why don't you ask Mr. Lairtides? He'll tell you. I'm not the killing people sort." "Frank Lairtides told us about the cake," Mr. Tanner said quietly. "He's as shocked and appalled as the rest of us. Blames himself, he said." That was a singularly nasty moment, because Mr. Lairtides was the only person who could corroborate the story about how Paul Carpenter turned into Phil Marlowe. It had crossed Paul's mind several minutes ago that one way out of the mess would be to turn back. It'd be embarrassing, sure enough, and there'd be a lot of very awkward questions, but at least he wouldn't be a murder suspect. Phil Marlowe would simply disappear, and Paul Carpenter would come back again, like a soap opera character stepping out of the shower. But Paul wasn't at all sure that he could turn himself back without Mr. Lairtides' help, and now it seemed that either Mr. Lairtides believed he was a cold-blooded killer, or else he was trying to frame him. "I think I've had about enough of you for one day," Mr. Tanner said. "We're having a partners' meeting in an hour to decide what to do with you. Shouldn't take long. In the meantime, you'll stay here. You can try and escape if you feel so inclined. But then my third and fifth cousins here will rip you into shreds and eat you. And there's a remote chance that that'll be a nastier way to die than the one we decide on at the meeting. Up to you, really. Wouldn't want to influence your decision one way or another." The door snapped shut behind him. Paul could hear soft, muffled clicks as the wards of the lock dropped into place. Between him and the door stood the four goblins. They were watching him the way Hong Kong gourmets study the restaurant cartpool. He wondered what on earth he was going to say to Mr. Dow this time. Probably it wouldn't be so bad, not once he'd settled in. What was it Mr. Dow had said? Nothing to hope for, nothing to be afraid of. He had, of course, an incredible advantage over all other human beings who'd ever stared death in the face before. Been there, done that, and got the winding sheet. He knew exactly what was coming next, and sure, it was a swizzle that he'd miss out on the rest of his life. All the years he could reasonably have expected to live, the balance of his miserable, insecure 20s, followed by the stressed-out 30s, responsibility-laden 40s, gradually dwindling 50s, over-the-hill 60s, decrepit 70s, and so on, assuming he'd ever made it that far. There would be spring, summer, autumn, winter that he wouldn't be there to see, and life would go on for everybody else. But in all fairness, he couldn't really get terribly worked up about that, since he'd always have been Paul Carpenter, for whom life would always prove to be a parcel excitingly wrapped in brightly coloured Christmas paper containing socks. The edge of the scythe was no big deal. It comes sooner or later, and once it's done its job, everything falls into a perspective so vast that none of it could possibly matter. People are mostly afraid of death because of the pain it'll bring to those who love and need them. But Paul had been to his own funeral, seen the dry eyes, and a remarkably small amount of grief and misery his absence had caused. Nothing to hope for, nothing to be afraid of. It wasn't what he'd have chosen for himself, and on a fundamental level it was bitterly unfair, to the point where, if he'd had the time and the stationery, he might even have written to the papers or his MP about it. Maybe even thought about starting up a pressure group, People Against Death or the Anti-Mortality Network. But it could so easily have been a whole lot worse. Somebody might have given a damn. He still couldn't decide on what to say to Mr. Dow. Fourth time unlucky was a bit too flip. I'm back, a trifle understated. He toyed with, "You call this an awfully big adventure?" But there was the risk that Mr. Dow wouldn't get the reference, like it mattered anyhow. Very soon there'd be nothing left of him at all, and, in all conscience, he couldn't see how that'd be a great loss to the universe, or to himself. The goblins were scowling at Paul, all fiery red eyes and pointy teeth. At any other time he had been scared stiff, but now there was nothing to be afraid of, and it was a bit dull, just sitting here. He looked at the biggest goblin and smiled. "Hey," he said, "you, turd face." The goblin didn't like that. Paul could see him making an effort to control his temper. It was amusing, really. "I'm talking to you," he said. "Here, you fancy a game of cards or something?" The goblin sneered, baring further and sharper teeth. Paul shrugged. "Screw you, then. You've lost anyway. I can tell just by looking at you that you are really, really stupid as well as incredibly ugly. Also," he added after a moment's reflection, "you smell. Not as badly as the other three, I grant you, but pretty bad nonetheless. Tell me, are you soluble in water or just totally slobby?" The goblin just stood and stared, and Paul gave up. We've got to stop meeting like this? Nah, too cliched. Mr. Dow, I presume. A bit lacking in sparkle. Probably better just to smile politely and ask where the lavatories were. Psst. He frowned. It was a goblin voice. Sibilants through a mouthful of very long teeth are quite distinctive, but none of the four guards had said anything, and he was pretty sure it had come from behind him. "It's me. Don't look round." Interesting? Maybe not interesting enough to stay alive for, but Paul's curiosity was piqued. Also, he didn't much feel like looking round anyway. He knew the strong room. There was nothing on that wall apart from shelves and a few battered old tin boxes. "It's me," the voice repeated. "Colin, wanted to ask you. You still got those Vans P crystals?" Colin. Oh, yes, the goblin he'd met in the pub, who'd offered him £4 million for the rest of the crystals he'd stolen from the jar in the professor's desk. Also the goblin who'd briefly replaced Sophie in St. James's Park. Hence, presumably, the inquiry. Very slowly he lifted his head, then pressed his chin against his chest. Swap, I'll rescue you for the crystals. Deal? Paul repeated the manoeuvre. One of the guards looked up, but only briefly. Why not? Paul thought. They won't be any good to me where I'll be going if I don't get out of here quickly. Done. Stay still. Don't move. At last, orders he could obey to the letter. Annoyingly, the tip of his nose chose that moment to start itching, but he ignored it. The light went out. Cursing and clattering over in the direction of the doorway told Paul where the goblins were, also low muttered bitching about which of them was supposed to have brought the torch. Assuming it was Colin who'd somehow doused the light, a single shadeless 60-watt bulb Paul remembered from earlier visits, he didn't see how it was going to help, since the guards were still very much in place between him and the door, which was the only way out. So, neat trick, but he was underwhelmed. He yawned slightly. Then someone grabbed him by the sleeve and hissed, "Come on," in a rather frantic whisper. Paul stood up and allowed the invisible hand to guide him until his shin banged into something hard and thin. His best guess was the shelves in the back wall. Conclusion, Colin was taking him in the wrong direction. Goblins, Paul thought, with an unuttered sigh. Now, the voice said in his ear. Before he could ask, now what, or anything along those lines, a heavy boot kicked the backs of his knees, folding him up like a newly ironed shirt, and a solid hand in the small of his back shoved him forward off balance. He grabbed for support to stop himself going down flat on his face, but there wasn't anything to grab onto. He felt himself lurch forward. He was falling. Squelch. Even before he'd spat out the mouthful he'd unintentionally ingested, Paul knew what he'd fallen into, because it was practically inevitable. Soft, squidgy, and he was wallowing in the stuff. So this is what it's like to be a prune, he thought, as he felt himself starting to sink. There are many terrible ways to die, and during his more morbid moments he'd speculated about quite a few of them, but drowning in custard wasn't a possibility he'd ever addressed. Short-sighted of him, he realised, bearing in mind just how lousy his luck could be. Then a hand grabbed the collar of his jacket. There was an unspeakably vulgar slurpy sucking noise, and he was out of the custard back into the air. He tried to open his eyes, but they were gummed shut with the foul stuff, and by the time he'd wiped it out of the way with his knuckles, it'd been stood upright again, like a toy soldier. He wobbled a bit until he got his balance back and looked around. Oh, for crying out loud, Paul thought. I'm still in the bloody strong room. That horrible little goblin screwed up a rescue, and I'm back where I... But then he noticed a couple of significant details. No guards, oil light lit, door open. There you go, said Colin the Goblin, slapping him offensively on the back. Piece of cake, no pun intended. Right, where are those crystals? Hang on. Paul turned until he could see the Goblin who'd been standing behind him. Give me a moment, will you? The Goblin nodded. Paul took a couple of deep breaths and knuckled away a bit more custard from his eyes and face. Then, with a degree of speed and agility he didn't think himself capable of, he whirled round and grabbed Colin's throat in both hands. What the fuck? Colin spluttered, and then found he was a bit short on air. Quiet! Paul snapped. Right. First things first, he thought. Thanks, he said politely. For rescuing me, I mean. The rest of Colin's face was turning as red as his eyes, and he was gurgling like the last quarter pint of water going down the plug hole. Paul took that as meaning, you're welcome, and nodded. Next, he went on, if you ever do anything like that to me again, I'm going to squeeze your neck until your head bursts. Got that? Colin nodded a little, enough to be going on with. Sure? Paul asked. Another nod, accompanied by a sort of wheezy snort. He let go and Colin flopped to the ground in a messy heap. That's all right then, Paul said briskly. You bastard, he added. Just look at me. I'm all covered in bloody custard. Replaying that one in his mind, Paul had to admit he was probably stating the extremely obvious. Now then, he went on, how do we get out of here? Door, muttered Colin, and waved a claw. Yes, I can see that, thank you very much, Paul sighed. I wasn't talking about the room, actually. I meant this whatever it is, where we are now, this dimension thing. He shrugged. Custard space, or whatever you want to call it. Only I've been in it already once today, and I know how you get yourself into it, but not how you leave. Presumably you know the answer to that. Colin the Goblin scowled up at him, his red eyes bright with loathing and terror. Yup, he said, and there's no need to go strangling me when I've just saved your stupid life. I didn't strangle you, Paul pointed out. I just squashed your neck a bit. Quite a big difference. All right, whatever. Now, said Colin, getting to his feet. He wasn't covered in custard from head to foot, Paul couldn't help noticing. Give me those bloody crystals, or you can stay here forever for all I care. Paul smiled. Haven't got them on me, sorry, he said. You think I'd carry something as valuable as that around in my trousers pocket? No, you want them, you get me out of here, and I'll fetch them for you. Can't say further than that. Colin the Goblin seemed to take the announcement very badly. His eyes widened and he growled like a dog. Fucking humans, he said angrily. No principles. No wonder our lot don't want to have anything to do with you people, quite apart from the fact that you're all ugly as hell. You might have mentioned you didn't have the stupid things on you before we started this. Yeah, right, Paul said. Because if I'd have told you that, I'd still be in there. You wouldn't have rescued me if you'd have known I hadn't got the stuff with me. Absolutely right, Colin replied crisply, for the simple reason that we need Fanspy's crystals to get out of here. Without them, what's the word I'm looking for? Begins with an S. Screwed. No, but pretty close. Stranded, that's it, no crystals. We're here forever. Oh, thought Paul. Bummer. You idiot, he snapped guiltily. Why the hell didn't you mention that before? Because I naturally assumed. Colin the Goblin waved his arms in the air in a gesture of wretched resignation. He looked like a very small, wizened actor performing Greek tragedy in Semaphore. Serves me right for thinking one of you lot have had the brains to figure it out. Fancy crystals. He sighed and sat down cross-legged on the ground, like Rumpelstiltskin in a book of fairy tales. That's what they do, he said sadly. That's why they're so incredibly valuable. They're how you get in here. Paul frowned. That's not right, he said. You get in here by gorging yourself on custard. I proved it by experiment, or wallowing about in the stuff apparently, but custard's definitely the key. Colin sighed again, longer, louder and sadder. That's where you're wrong. Custard's not the key, it's the door. Fanspy's crystals are the key. He frowned, allergic to metaphors, probably unless the mental image of a custard door was doing strange things to the inside of his head. Look, he said, this is neither the time nor the place for a magic theory tutorial. Bottom line is, guzzling custard on its own doesn't fetch you here, otherwise the place would be crowded out, standing room only. You need to have swallowed the crystals first. They do something to you on the atomic level. They sort of make it so you can slide through the mesh. Once you're in, though, you need another dose to get out again, otherwise... Hang on, Paul interrupted. That time at St. James's Park, did you know all this back then? Colin shook his head. It was that set me trying to find out about the stuff, he replied. All I knew about it at the time was how much it was worth. I thought if you'd gone to all the trouble and risk of stealing so much of the stuff right at the professor's desk, well, I assumed you must know what it does, or why nick it in the first place. Paul winced. Easy mistake to make. So was treading on a landmine. This is the first I've heard of it, he said heavily. What you've just told me, I mean. I sort of figured a bit of it out from first principles, like how this place exists, kind of at right angles to the real world, and how it had something to do with stupid bloody custard, but I thought, whatever, Colin shrugged. You write it up for the scientific journals and send me a copy. Meanwhile, we're stuck in here forever and ever, so really it's not amazingly helpful agonising over how we got here in the first place. He scowled, then a look of great bewilderment crossed his face. What did you say just now? Several things, Paul pointed out. Which particular? You said, Colin continued, you said this is the second time today you've been in here. Perfectly true, actually. Great, Colin said. So you know how to get out again. Paul couldn't help grinning. Absolutely right. I know precisely how you go about it, and not a crystal in sight. All you actually need is the other half of a living sword. A what? Well, might you ask? Me, I haven't got a clue, but it worked fine earlier on, that's all I'm saying. With a long, dreary sigh, Paul sat down on the floor next to Colin. Look, he said, it seems like we're in this shit so deep we need a pair of extra long snorkels. How'd it be if we pigeonholed stressing out and scoring points off each other for now, and tried to figure out a way of escaping? I mean, he added as Colin frowned at the bewildering novelty of the idea, you obviously know a lot of stuff about these things, clearly much more than I do. A small cottage loaf knows more about magic than you do. Very true, Paul admitted. And the bit I know it is a bit more than I'd like, believe me. On the other hand, your choice of people to cooperate with is rather limited right now, and you never know, I might come in useful. Also, he added quickly, I've got that jar of crystals back home. If we get out of this in one piece, they're yours. No charge. A slight quiver of nose and ear told Paul that he finally had Colin's undivided attention. Well, the Goblin said eventually, I suppose it can't hurt, fool's luck and all that. And if getting out of here turns out to involve getting things down off higher shelves, I guess you'd be better at it than me. All right, you're on. He paused. Got any ideas? Paul shook his head. But I might have, he added, if only I had just the faintest glimmer of a notion of what the hell's going on here. For instance, what's with the whole Custard thing? You mean you... Bewilderment, contempt, even a faint trace of amusement. Well, for pity's sake, Colin said. Everybody knows that, even humans. Paul shook his head. Everybody except me. Colin stretched out his legs. Cramp, probably. It's totally basic, really. The world is made up out of 4 elements, right? Earth, air, fire, water. Scientific types to try and kid you into believing there's a whole load of other elements with funny-sounding Latin names all blending in You don't want to take any notice of that. There are only 4 elements, and everything else is just a mixture of them. Your lot have known that ever since the Dark Ages, but clearly you weren't paying attention in school or something. Oddly enough, Paul shrugged. Go on. Well, that's it, more or less. Or it was up until about 30 years ago. For reasons that will become clear, it's rather hard to pinpoint the precise date. The important thing is there are now 5 elements. Earth, air, fire, water, and a sort of slimy, sweet-tasting yellow gooey stuff. Custard. Colin pulled a, sort of face. Actually, not custard, he said. At least not custard as we know it, Jim. Looks like it, smells like it, feels like it, tastes like it, but that's where the resemblance ends. I see, Paul lied. So not custard. But we call it custard, Colin added. For convenience, really. Of course, it's the 5th element. Fine, glad we cleared that up. Exactly. Colin yawned. And like I just said, it came out of nowhere not that long ago. Theo Van Spee invented it. It's what he's famous for. You mean he discovered it? Colin shook his head. No, he said. Invented. It's what's its name? Synthetic. Artificial. Van Spee made it. Cooked it up on a stove or something. Now, of course, it's everywhere, like Russian vine. Then it can't be an element, surely. A pained look crossed Colin's face. Yes, it can, he snapped, because it is. You want to know how he managed it? You go ask him. Anyhow, there you go. Point is, things made out of the 5th element exist sideways to everything else. It copies anything it comes into contact with, you see. Exact replicas. Only thing it can't copy is life. But inanimate objects, no trouble at all. And if you swallow some Van Spee's crystals, you can sort of wiggle through, in and out of it. That's how the fold-in parking space works, and all the other stuff Van Spee's come up with over the years, such as the buildings that sit on top of each other, like Russian dolls, except they're all the same size. You can see what a gold mine it is. I suppose so, Paul replied, his mind elsewhere. He was thinking of the circumstances of Ricky Wormtorter's death, also about the living sword that could transcend the elements. Some of it was starting to make sense, but it was the sort of sense you can see clearly at 3 a.m, when you've been drinking steadily since 6 o'clock the previous evening. He wasn't sure it would carry on making sense in any other context but this. So, he said, Van Spee invented this stuff simply to make money. Colin looked at him. Well, I imagine so. Why else would you bother? I don't know, Paul replied truthfully. Anyhow, thanks for filling me in. Of course, I still can't think of any way of getting out of here, but at least I'm doomed but informed rather than doomed and ignorant. That's progress, isn't it? Not what it's cracked up to be, progress, Colin replied. So what'll we do next? Noughts and crosses? Paul shook his head. I have a cunning plan, he said. It won't work, of course, because I'm missing something really blindingly obvious, though I don't actually know what it is yet. Still, giving it a trial help pass the time, I guess. You up for it, or would you rather stay here? Colin shrugged. Tell me what you've got in mind, he said. Nah, you'll see it's too stupid to be worth trying. Paul stood up. You coming? Why not? Colin rose, winced a bit as he put his weight on his feet, pins and needles probably, and hobbled after Paul as he headed for the door. 70 St Mary Axe was pretty much the same in Custard space as it was in real life, with the important and rather pleasant difference that they had the place to themselves. No armed goblin guards, no partners, not even a single solitary spider in the nets of cobweb up in the corners of the hallway ceilings. Annoyingly, none of the lights worked. Nothing electric worked, apparently, but someone had thoughtfully left a couple of lit oil lamps on the front desk. "Up the stairs," Paul said. "Top floor." Custard Space stairs were just as steep, and there were just as many of them. Eventually they reached the door of Professor Van Spee's office. Paul halted in front of it and caught his breath. "This is one of the points at which this could go horribly wrong," he announced cheerfully. "Feel free to leave if you don't fancy the risk." "You don't get shot of me that easily." "Didn't want to. All right, here goes. Only don't blame me if we find Van Spee sitting behind the desk." The thought of that made Colin turn faintly green, but he kept his apprehensions to himself. "Get on with it," he said. "I'll wait outside in case anybody comes." Paul glowered at him scornfully. You're scared." "Of course I'm bloody scared. That's Professor Van Spee's office you're about to break into, and you thought death was bad." Paul knocked loudly 3 times. Then he turned the doorknob and walked in. The office was uninhabited, to his great relief. Also, the desk was where it ought to be, exactly the same in all respects as its counterpart in real space. That was what Paul had been hoping for. He slid open the second drawer from the top, and a surge of joy mixed half and half with amazement flooded through him. It was there, where he'd hoped it would be. A glass jar about the size of a soda siphon, 3/4 full of something that looked like coffee sugar. Couldn't be that simple, could it? But this was Professor Van Spee's desk in Professor Van Spee's office, and this was the very same jar Paul had burgled not so long ago, and so it was difficult to believe that these could be Professor Van Spee's famous patent crystals, as recommended by larcenous goblin pharmacists everywhere. Yes, it was, because nothing was ever that convenient. Gobble a mouthful of these, and God only knew where he'd end up. What if they let him through to a dimension at right angles to this dimension? And if only he'd paid attention in school like every other bugger, he'd know if right angles to a right angle ended you up out in hyperspace or back where you started. But there, maths, the 12-year-old Paul Carpenter had declared with the unassailable arrogance of youth. When am I ever going to need to know any of this stuff? Paul picked the jar up, even got as far as fiddling with the lid, but he couldn't bring himself to take the risk. What if these crystals dumped him in yet another iffy dimension? Would there be a drawer in a desk containing a jar full of crystals, and what would happen to him if he munched a handful of them? It'd be like that old gag about being trapped in a room with mirrors on all 4 walls. It could finish up bounding mercilessly through time and space, like the misdirected luggage of an airline passenger. Shaking his head, he stooped to put the jar back where he had got it from, and in doing so caught sight of a sheet of yellow paper, the sort J.W. used for internal memos. To P.A.C. from TVS. Your caution is both uncharacteristic and commendable. However, there is nothing to worry about. The crystals in this jar will return you to normal 4-elemental space. Nonetheless, for your own safety, you are advised not to steal from this jar again. You have failed the 5th test. All is not lost. Even so, one more failure will lead to regrettable consequences. Bastard, Paul thought, though he wasn't quite sure why. He opened the jar, shuffled a handful of crystals into his palm, put the jar back, and went out before he saw anything else that might upset him. "Here," he said. "Now what?" Colin the Goblin looked at the crystals in his hand, then slowly up at him. "You jammy git," he said softly. "Are those—" Paul nodded. "Like falling off a log. Do we eat them, or dissolve them in water, or what?" "Where'd you get them from? Are there any more?" Goblins, Paul thought. "Answer the question," he said. "What are we supposed to do with them now we've got them? Do we swallow them, or do they just—" He got no further, because Colin grabbed his wrist and buried his face in a pile of crystals in Paul's hand, licking at them like a dog. Then he vanished. "I'll take that as a yes," Paul said aloud to the space where Colin had been. Not such an unreasonable thing to do, since, if he'd made any sense of any of this stuff, Colin was still there, precisely where he'd been a moment ago, except in a different axis. Still, Paul felt a certain reluctance to put in his mouth anything that a goblin had just licked, so he carefully picked out a couple of crystals on the edge of the pile with his other hand and raised them to his lips, like someone taking a very small pill. Here goes, he thought. Then someone screamed right in front of him. He jumped, scattering the crystals everywhere. Paul! The shock had made him shut his eyes. When he opened them again, he saw Sophie standing where Colin the Goblin had been, staring at him though she'd seen a ghost, which, of course, from her viewpoint, she just had. Soph? Don't call me Sophie, he snapped impatiently. It's all right, I can... She took a couple of steps back, and the wall got in her way. Oh, what are you doing here, Paul? I thought you were dead. He could feel his face adjusting itself into some stupid expression, an inane half grin or something of the sort. It was the sort of expression that wouldn't have fitted on the strong, confident face of Phil Marlowe. Also, Sophie had recognised him. Clearly, Paul Carpenter was back in town. Depends on how you define... Bastard! She lunged forward like an Olympic fencer and smacked him round the face with her fist. Paul did the only honourable thing in the circumstances. He wobbled for a moment, folded at the knees and sat down on the floor very hard. He also tried to apologise, but there was something not quite right about his jaw. I cried, Sophie was yelling. I cried and cried because I thought you were bloody dead, and here you are, still bloody alive. And what the hell am I doing here anyway? Last thing I knew, I was in a lady's toilet, just about to... She stopped and scowled at him. You are Paul, aren't you? I mean, you're not some stupid goblin in disguise or anything like that. Paul nodded and then realised the gesture was ambiguous. He mumbled, and his mouth felt like it was full of razor-sharp flints. Really? Then why the hell does everybody think you're dead? And where have you been? And... Okay. What? You really cried? Paul said painfully. Just because you thought... Oh, for God's sake! For a moment he thought Sophie was going to kick him. And why are you talking in that stupid voice? I think you broke my jaw. Good. And has this got anything to do with that other time in St. James's Park with the other... She stopped and stared at him. Something uncomfortable was slowly taking shape in her mind, like a square egg inside a small chicken. Of course, Paul thought, I could have explained all this really quickly and succinctly if some dozy cow hadn't smashed my face in. It's me, he said. Yes, I died, but I escaped, like I did in the other times, and yes, it's sort of like the St. James's Park thing, though I don't actually know why it's doing it. Look, would it be all right if we did this explaining stuff later, because... He tailed off. A horrible thought had just occurred to him. Before, in St. James's Park, Sophie had gone away and Colin had taken her place. This time, Colin had gone away and here she was. Paul had a nasty feeling that it was something like those funny mechanical clocks you get sometimes in old churches and town halls and places like that. The little man comes out when it's sunny, and a little woman pops out when it's going to rain. As soon as one comes out, the other one's whisked back in, because that's how the mechanism works. If that was how it was, and Sophie was somehow linked to Colin concerning exits and entrances in Custard space, it had been Colin's escape that had drawn her here, which was fine up to a point, provided there wasn't going to be a problem getting her back home again. Or either of them come to that. Paul had spilled all the crystals when Sophie had screamed, and the professor's memoir had left him in little doubt about the risks incumbent on going back and stealing another dose. He winced a little. Quite apart from the nameless horror of being stranded in Custard space forever, it was yet another damn thing to explain, and no jaw to do it with. Because what? Because my face hurts where you hit it. He shut his eyes for a couple of seconds. Sorry, he mumbled. I really can't talk anymore, really. Sophie muttered something about men in general that Paul didn't quite catch, and then went on. Right, first things first, we'd better get you to a doctor, see if you've really hurt your jaw. Then you can explain. Why are you gawping at me like that? Resourcefulness had never been one of the qualities Paul would have attributed to himself, but if necessity were the mother of invention, extreme pain in the face was at the very least its aunt. Nodding his head to make Sophie follow him, he led the way down one flight of stairs, along one bit of corridor, and into the room where the laser printer lurked. It was, of course, deserted, but there was a computer station there, and the computer was switched on. He sat down and started to type. "It's like this," he wrote. "We're in a sort of alternate dimension. I was trapped here. You got pulled into it by a goblin called Colin Leaving, I think, though I'm not sure. Trouble is, I don't know how we get out again. Also, going back wouldn't be a really good idea for me right now, since they think I killed Ricky Wormtoter." "No, they don't," Sophie interrupted. "They think you're dead, remember? Anyhow, it's that creep Philip Marlowe. They practically caught him red-handed. Oh, you didn't know him. He was after you." She stopped and scowled. "Just a second. How do you know about that if you've been trapped in this whatever it is you called it?" "Oh," Paul went back and deleted that. "It's complicated." "You don't say." "You think Philip Marlowe's a creep? I thought you liked him." Sophie opened her mouth and then closed it again. "Now you come to mention it," she said. "So did I, but not anymore, apparently. Look, what's that got to do with anything?" If only I knew a bit more about typing, Paul thought. I could set up "it's complicated" as a macro and save myself a lot of work. "Later," he typed. "Look, I'll explain everything later, I promise. Only now, His fingers uncurled. Only now what? By now, back in real space, Dennis Tanner would have discovered that Phil Marlowe had escaped from the strong room, quite probably. Also, Mr. Lairtides would have told everybody about who Phil Marlowe really was. It definitely wouldn't be safe to go back, either as Phil or as Paul. Staying here, on the other hand, in an empty building, presumably an entirely deserted universe, didn't strike Paul as a good idea either. And even if he could get back somehow, if he risked Professor Vansby's dire warning and stole some more crystals, there was the danger that Sophie'd be stuck here. It was all much, much too difficult, and he really wished it was happening to someone else, preferably his worst enemy. Only now I haven't got a clue what to do next. Any suggestions? And then Sophie did something completely unexpected, not to mention out of character. She smiled. It was almost a smirk, only Sophie didn't smirk, the way whales rarely tap dance. "Yes," she said. "Budge over. I need to get to the keyboard." A wave of blessed relief hit Paul like a large velvet hammer, because for what seemed like forever, he'd been very much on his own, having to cope with all manner of weird and terrible things, and now here was Sophie, pushing him out of the way in a manner that implied that she knew what to do. Paul had, of course, loved her since the first time he'd set eyes on her, but that had been his Pavlovian reaction to any girl who stayed still for 5 minutes and didn't stamp on his foot while wearing stiletto heels. He'd loved her like he'd loved all the others, back then, before he took the medicine. There hadn't been any reason, because love, like other forms of psychotic behaviour, doesn't need a reason, and if he'd been called into the witness box, put on oath and asked why he loved her, he'd have to admit that it was the same impulse that made people climb mountains, simply because she was there. Now maybe, for the first time, there was something he could love her for, because after everything he had to go through on his own, right at the very furthest extreme of his rope, she was suddenly there and taking charge. True, she'd also hit him very hard in the face, but nobody's perfect. He glanced down at the screen. Mail right. She was typing fast, her fingers scampering across the keys like the legs of a bold pink spider's. To D. Tanner at JWW.net. Then she hit the return key a couple of times and typed in, "Help." And before Paul could reach down and stop her, Sophie hit the send button.